Welcome to Longevity by Design, a podcast designed to give individuals access to the leading scientific information in the field of longevity. The ability to add years to your life and life to your years needs no opinion. Join us as we ask science to take the wheel. In each episode, Dr. Gil Blander joins a co-host and an industry expert in the field of longevity, shining a light and getting the answers to the key question: how can we live a longer, healthier life?
Hello, I'm Ashley Reaver. Welcome to Longevity by Design, How to Live a Longer, Healthier Life. We're produced by Inside Tracker, your science-based guide to optimizing your body from the inside out. Our guest today is Dr. Jennifer Garrison. Dr. Garrison was a recent guest on Longevity by Design, and we enjoyed our conversation so much that we asked her to come back for round 2. During our first episode together, we talked a bit about the functions of the hypothalamus, its role in the aging process, and then discussed some issues related to women's health. We briefly went over premature ovarian aging, the health implications of menopause, and gender inequality in research. Our initial dialogue around women's health was so interesting, we decided to dedicate a whole episode to take a deeper dive into this topic. Dr. Garrison is a neuroscientist holding PhDs in chemistry and chemical biology. She has years of experience studying ovarian aging and female reproductive decline in her lab at the Buck Institute. Thank you so much for being here with us again today.
Oh, thanks for having me.
So welcome back, Jennifer. And we previously discussed how menopause and reproductive decline impact healthspan. And would like to look further into that and maybe go deeper and satisfy the curiosity of our audience, because I'm sure that most of us don't know a lot about it. So would like to start with a bit more detailed explanation about menopause. What is menopause? What happened to the woman body during that process? And what is perimenopause?
Oh, yeah. Let's start with definitions. I think a lot of people get confused about menopause because it's actually just a single day in a woman's life. So menopause is defined as the day on which a woman has not had a period for 12 months. So it's a single day. Everything before menopause is considered perimenopause, and everything after is postmenopause. So much of what we talk about when we're discussing symptoms of menopause are actually symptoms of perimenopause. And perimenopause is a period of time before that single day, which can last for some women anywhere between 4 and 10 years. So it's actually a large phase of a woman's life. And this is a period of time where hormones are fluctuating, lots of things are happening. And I think maybe the most accurate description of perimenopause is that there is no predicting what's going to happen during perimenopause. That's the most predictable thing about it, is that you can't predict what's going to happen. And it's a different experience for every woman. I think, those are the definitions as close as we can get to them.
And is there an initial starting point?
Well, when we stop having periods, it's because ovaries have run out of eggs. So the number and the quality of eggs that a woman has declines beginning before birth. And essentially, when a woman runs out of eggs, that is what leads to menopause. So at the same time, ovaries are producing a whole cocktail of chemicals and hormones that are really important for general health. And so as those levels decline with age, and as a woman approaches menopause, that can lead to a whole host of different symptoms. Many women experience symptoms during perimenopause. Something like 75% of women reported some, if not all, symptoms that are associated with it. So those are things like mood changes, hot flashes, sleep problems, vaginal dryness, issues with sexual function, bone loss, fluctuating estrogen and progesterone levels that can lead to irregular periods. And that means they can be shorter cycles, longer cycles, heavier bleeding, lighter bleeding. Again, the most the most predictable thing about perimenopause is that there's no predicting what's going to happen. There's actually a really hilarious, I thought it was hilarious, satirical piece in McSweeney's.net about this, where they were satirizing a call-in hotline about perimenopause. I highly recommend that you look that up if you haven't read it already.
And in our last episode, you talked a bit about the correlation between menopause with age-related diseases or chronic diseases. Do we see kind of even those that experience menopause earlier, are those correlations with chronic disease independent of age? Or is it, post 50 we see things, or if someone goes through menopause at 35, we start to see those same correlations?
Yeah, it really is independent of age, and it totally depends on ovarian function. So early menopause obviously can be caused by lots of different things. Chemotherapy is one of the major things that can push a woman into early menopause, but then there are also unexplained things, POI, things like that can push women into early menopause for reasons that we don't fully understand. And what's striking about that is that in young women, when they go through early menopause, there's, it's considered a serious medical condition. It's sort of shocking and destructive, these health effects that happen after ovaries stop functioning in a woman's body. It shortens their lifespan. It causes brittle bones, cognitive decline. And in young women, when this happens, the medical community treats this as incredibly serious and prescribes hormones. But then when exactly the same thing happens in older women, we say it's just getting older. It's something we should accept. And it's just really just dramatically different how we treat exactly the same condition in young and older women. Now, in terms of the health consequences of menopause, they're exactly the same. So a young woman who goes through early menopause is going to experience those same exact health risks. So that includes things like increased risk of stroke and cardiovascular disease, osteoporosis, cognitive decline, all sorts of things that really we would like to avoid.
So it's look like or sounds like menopause is not something that we would like to have and we would like to delay it as long as possible. So are there any intervention or clinical trials or anything that at least in the future can allow women to maybe observe menopause later or later in life, or maybe never have a menopause?
Not that I'm aware of. I am not aware of any clinical trials that are ongoing that would extend reproductive span. This is an area of science and medicine that has been largely neglected. I mean, women's health in general has been understudied and underfunded, but particularly around aging and reproductive health. There's just a real lack of data and a real lack of interest in the past. That's changing now. So it's a positive message that things are changing, that we're waking up to the idea that this is an important thing to figure out. But I'm not aware of anything right now.
Yeah, that's crazy that nobody is trying to do anything yet. It's really sad.
I mean, we're trying. This is part of what this is why I've devoted most of my time to this is to try to increase the number of scientists and clinicians who are working on these questions, because truly, trying to understand why ovaries age prematurely, trying to understand what those causal factors are, this is not rocket science. It's really something that we can figure out. We just need to do the work.
Absolutely.
You talked a little bit before about how hormone levels of estrogen and progesterone are, changing, and that causes the cycles during perimenopause to be shorter, be longer. After the day of menopause, so in postmenopausal period for women, Do those hormone levels still fluctuate? Are they, kind of completely at zero, so to speak? What happens to hormone levels post-menopause?
Yeah. So after menopause, things like estrogen and progesterone definitely go down and they stay down. FSH and LH tend to go up. So there's just kind of inversion of what's happening normally after menopause, and it's different in every woman, and it takes on a different time trajectory, and also overall what's happening. It's going to be different for every woman, and that maybe predicts or specifies how severe the symptoms are that she's going to experience, right? Some women are lucky to not experience very many of those symptoms that I mentioned before. Other women are going to have them really severely, and all of that depends on where your hormone levels end up.
And is
Jennifer, Jennifer, can you please elaborate about those hormones? Because for you as a scientist, I'm sure that it's all clear, but if we are trying to explain it to someone that is not a scientist, what is each hormone and what is the role of that hormone? That will be very appreciated.
Yeah, so the ones that people talk about the most, and the ones that we know the most about in terms of what the ovaries are making, are estrogen, progesterone, and also testosterone. But most of the time when we're talking about cycling with respect to the menstrual cycle, we're talking about estrogen and progesterone. And so, you can split up, if you think about one cycle, and by the way, they're never 28 days. That idea of a 28-day cycle is total myth. Again, it fluctuates, with each individual person, but very few cycles are actually 28 days long. But you can really split them into two parts. And the first part, which is the follicular phase, is really basically getting the egg ready to be ovulated, and that basically it's basically estrogen is going up during that phase. And progesterone is low, and then you get a spike of LH and FSH right when ovulation happens, which is in the middle of the cycle. Then the second part of the cycle is really just there to prepare the uterus for pregnancy. So with every cycle, our human uteruses, they behave as though there's going to be a pregnancy. And so that second part of the cycle, estrogen goes down, progesterone goes up. And that prepares the lining of the uterus for potential implantation of an embryo. And then if that doesn't happen, you get shedding of the uterine lining, and that's what we experience as a period. So, and in that second part of the cycle, FSH and LH go down low. And so there's this really dynamic back and forth and sort of changing of the hormones over the course of a cycle. And then it repeats. And so that happens every single cycle. And as a woman gets older and comes closer to approaching menopause, what happens is that levels of estrogen decline, because those are related to the number of eggs that are left there. And progesterone also goes down. And then FSH and LH actually go up. And what happens is, during the perimenopausal period, things get really wonky and start to fluctuate back and forth. And part of the reason that happens is because those four major hormones that I just described, that are being made by the estrogen and progesterone are being made by the ovary, but LH and FSH are being made in the brain and the pituitary. And essentially they're in a feedback loop. And so when one thing gets out of whack, that can cause ripple effects for all of those other hormones. And so as things start to change and fluctuate, all sorts of crazy things can happen. And that's really what we observe when we're looking at the symptoms that happen during menopause and perimenopause. And so after menopause, ovaries do still continue to make some other hormones. And so this gets a little bit into the weeds in terms of the science. but androgens, which can be converted to forms of estrogens. There's lots of different forms of estrogen. One is called estrone. The one that we're constantly talking about, usually, and the one that I was just describing is called estradiol. But there's an enzyme that can convert androgens like testosterone into estrone in adipose tissue. And so, as you know, after menopause, ovaries are still putting out small amounts of these androgens that can get converted to estrone, which can then be converted to estradiol in the peripheral tissues. So there's still, there is still the potential to have some estrogen around. It's just not nearly as much as what you see in younger women. And again, it's not going through these fluctuating cycles that it would normally be doing. So there's a lot of differences before menopause and after menopause.
And
I hope that wasn't too technical.
No, it was great. And I was going to say a lot of
it was great.
Inter-individual differences, especially since that 28-day cycle is a myth. And obviously that's why your work is so important, because it is more difficult to, study female health, women's health at all times in the lifespan, but definitely in that perimenopausal phase too. It's hard to get a baseline of what normal looks like if normal is different for everyone.
That's a really good point. And I think I've said this before, I think it's really important to appreciate that female reproductive physiology is maybe one of the most complex signatures in all of human health. And that doesn't mean that we should ignore it. Rather, that we should appreciate that complexity and try to understand it, because these are the things that make all the difference. And understanding why there's so much inter-individual variability in age at menopause and susceptibility to symptoms of menopause, in all of these things will give us clues about what's happening in terms of ovarian aging.
Yeah. And so Jennifer, you explained it very nicely. I think that the simplest way that I heard about it, because I agree with you, it's so complex. You have at least 4 hormones that playing and making a lot of physiological changes in the woman body before menopause. So how what you describe explain what happened in the women body during the menopause? If you can, what I'm trying to say, if you can, I know that it's very complex, basically overlay the change in the hormones with the effect of the menopause.
Sure. So we've been talking about the big players, the ones, the steroid hormones and the protein hormones that we know the most about. I will also just mention that ovaries certainly make probably dozens of other chemicals, hormones that are important for health, and we may or may not actually know what all of them are at this point. So there's a lot of room for discovery here. But for those hormones that we're most familiar with, estrogen being the biggest player, the way that hormones work, the word hormone just means a chemical that can signal over long distances in the body. So that means, for example, what we've been talking about is between the brain and the ovaries and the uterus. But a hormone is just anything that can signal over a long distance. So that could be between different brain regions. It could be between the brain and the uterus, or between the fat and the brain, or, any which way you can just diagram that. And so the way that a hormone works is that it's released in one place. So, for example, estrogen is released from the ovaries, and it actually signals to the brain. And so the way that the brain senses that hormone is that it acts kind of like a catcher's mitt. So there are receptors on different tissues. So, for example, there's receptors on specific cells in the brain for estrogen. And when estrogen binds to those receptors, it activates downstream signaling pathways in that cell. So there are 3 kinds of estrogen receptors, and they are located all over the body and in different tissues. And they do different things there. But essentially what that means is that when estrogen is produced by the ovaries, it has important jobs to do any place where there's an estrogen receptor. And so there are estrogen receptors in your heart, in your fat, in your bone, in your muscles, in your brain, and in your breast, in all sorts of places. And so when estrogen goes away, all of those things that it was doing before in those tissues also goes away. And that's what we experience in terms of the symptoms of losing estrogen. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so to elaborate on that, I think that I got it, but I want to be sure that our audience got it. So, for example, it's well known that women, postmenopausal women, tend to gain fat. That can be because the estrogen doesn't regulate the fat cells anymore. That's correct or not?
There's an increase in visceral fat mass for sure. I'm not sure that we understand fully exactly what's happening there, but there's no question that when estrogen levels decline naturally at menopause, visceral fat goes up, bone mass decreases, muscle mass decreases, strength decreases, and those are all related to the loss of estrogen. And so some of those negative health consequences can be mitigated by trying to replace estrogen with hormone replacement therapy.
Yeah, and I assume that the same go to the heart.
Does that make
So the
sense?
count, yeah, it makes sense. So, and I assume that it's the same for the heart. That the increase of cardiovascular diseases postmenopausal again might be related to the decrease in estrogen, right?
Absolutely. Estrogen and possibly also progesterone. So progesterone has a
Okay.
lot of functions, a lot of different functions, but one of them is related to fluid volume and blood pressure. And so, yeah, it may also have something to do with progesterone,
Yeah.
but definitely estrogen has an important role to play in cardiovascular health.
And another point that I just came to my mind is literally you have here a feedback loop because the brain sends signal to the ovary and then the ovary sends back a signal to the brain. And in a way, postmenopausal, you lose the back signal, and that might make a lot of changes that are not something that we want to have, but actually it's happened because you have so little estrogen that the signal loop is basically blocked.
Exactly. That's exactly right. Yeah.
Yeah. And a follow-up to that, in the last episode, we discussed that there is a nice correlation. I wouldn't say nice, but maybe a strong correlation between the age of a menopause and basically the lifespan of the woman. Do we understand fully why is it? Why women that have a early menopause live shorter and women that have later menopause live longer, or not yet?
No, we have absolutely no idea. And that's a really intriguing question because if we could figure that out again, if we could figure out what was going on there, that would give us some clues about what was happening overall. So these are all, I would say these are the key questions that we need to answer. Why does it happen at all? Right? Because we're so strange as a species. Why do we have menopause at all? Why is it so variable at the level of the individual? And why is it correlated with overall lifespan? Why does reproductive span correlate so strongly with overall lifespan? Those are I think the key questions we need to answer right now with science.
Yeah.
The last time we talked about cardiovascular disease, sorry for my voice, I just had a coughing fit. How women postmenopausal, the risk of developing heart disease increases by 4 times. You just talked a little bit about how fluid balance perhaps is influenced by progesterone. Inflammation is something that we know also can accelerate that development of plaques in your arteries. Inflammation is such like a big, broad term, but does menopause, increase inflammation in certain tissues in the body? Do we know anything about that?
So I think there's a clear connection between age and basal levels of inflammation in a lot of different tissues. What the exact link is to menopause, I don't think that's been fully fleshed out. And I hate to keep giving the same answer. Like we really need to spend more time studying these things, but we really do. So I don't have a satisfactory answer to that question. Sorry.
More research is
Yeah. No,
a
that's
Certainly
satisfactory answer.
age and inflammation correlate. Yeah.
it's
We're
it's
working on it.
it's actually exciting, and I think that if a group of scientists are listening to our podcast, that's a great domain to start a study, because there are so many unknown that it's a great opportunity for everyone that want to make an impact in the scientific community, especially in longevity. That's maybe the next
I
frontier
certainly
of
think so. This is
yeah.
this is my message to everyone, that
Yeah.
if you care about aging research, you should really be thinking about ovaries.
Yeah.
And we literally just closed our second round of grant funding last week, so we're in the process of reviewing those applications now. But the hope is that we're going to give away another $7 million or so to scientists all over the world to stimulate research in this space.
That's great. So, Jennifer, we discussed it before about the feedback loop between the brain and the ovary. And we know that also during menopause, we see a cognitive decline. Do we understand that, or it's completely black box and we don't know why is it?
I mean, we do understand some of it, not all of it. I think certainly changes in estrogen levels can disrupt things like bioenergetics. And we know that the brain is really, really dependent on energy consumption. For something that takes up 2% of your body mass, your brain uses like 20% of your energy. So it's an energy hungry system. And any kinds of disruptions to the bioenergetics there can really wreak havoc. We also know that estrogen it's very important for different brain regions that are involved in things like learning, language, judgment. We know that in postmenopausal brains that estrogen loss is responsible for changes in dendritic spines, which are important for memory. And the part of the brain in the hypothalamus that senses estrogen is really important for all of these homeostatic systems. So things like energy and fluid homeostasis, body temperature regulation, sleep, and circadian rhythms. All of those circuits are kind of intermingled in the same brain region. And actually, one of the grantees that we funded in our first round of grants, Holly Ingram at UCSF, she published a beautiful paper showing that estrogen signaling in that part of the brain can lead to changes in physical activity in female mice, meaning that the neurons that regulate the balance between sedentary behavior and physical activity are basically regulated by estrogen. And so menopause is associated with this decline in estradiol or estrogen, and that shifts the activity of these neurons towards sedentary behavior, which is, mind-blowing that she was able to find that link. Yeah. So exciting stuff going on.
How about any differences? And this is, not necessarily the deep science of it, but really correlation between, different races or ethnicities and the average age that they experience menopause, and that being correlated to lifespan. Do we know anything kind of about that?
Yeah. So I think this is a part of the data set that I think we really need to make larger and to collect more data on. But there's some really intriguing preliminary data, and in fact, very recent data showing that there definitely is a difference between women of different ethnicities in terms of their how they experience perimenopause, the severity of their symptoms, which symptoms they experience. This is really dramatically impacted by genetics. And amazingly or horrifyingly, I'm not sure which it is, this data set came from a private company. It says a lot about us and where we are, to say that this data is being generated by a private company instead of by public endeavors. But Evernow put out a study, the largest study that I'm aware of, that really looked at changes and differences between women of different racial backgrounds and how they're experiencing perimenopause and menopause. And they saw some really interesting trends. Black women, for example, were more likely to experience more severe symptoms, and differences in which symptoms were more prevalent than white women. And they actually had a really interesting subgroup of women in this study that were of indigenous peoples origin. And again, they had a different constellation of symptoms and a different severity level than women who reported as white. So there certainly are different health outcomes and differences in terms of genetic background. But I would say we're just starting to scratch the surface on getting that data and really understanding what it means. And I will also say that genetics doesn't make up all of the story. There's a strong component that comes in from environment, both the microenvironment, meaning like what's going on inside of a woman's body as a functioning unit, but also the macroenvironment in terms of environmental pollutants, the kinds of things that we expose ourselves to, like cigarette smoke, for example, and then all of the things that influence our physiology, like diet and exercise. It's a really complex equation when you get right down to it.
Yeah. So that's a very good point about diet and exercise. And at InstaTracker, we have a very motivated population. And I'm sure that, I don't know, a woman at the age of 20 or 30 that listening to us today would like to know, what can I do? Can I eat better? Is there a specific food that I should eat more? Is it a specific kind of exercise that I should do more? What recommendation can you provide for a very motivated women that really want to delay the menopause as late as possible?
Sure. Well, I have to give a disclaimer that I probably should have mentioned at the beginning, which is that I'm a PhD scientist. I am not a medical doctor. So everything we're talking about, perimenopause, menopause, HRT, all of these things, these should all be conversations between a woman and her physician, because there's so many factors that go into these risk reward calculations that it's super important that people involve their doctors in all of these decisions. Having said that, I can tell you what I do without giving medical advice. I think is very clear from the work that's been done so far. It's very clear that every single thing we know about that influences healthy longevity is also having a positive impact on ovarian function. So, and the best things that we know to influence healthy longevity are diet and exercise, really paying attention to what you put into your body and how you treat your body. And that includes sleep. So I know there's so many people just want to have a magic bullet, but I mean, honestly, if you were to do a clinical trial on exercise and diet, and evaluate those things the same way that we evaluate drugs, the results would be like spectacular in terms of really what kind of effect you can have by doing those things. So that doesn't mean that you have to go out and run a marathon. There's a lot of evidence that moderate physical activity, just getting up and moving around during the day, are really beneficial. Building up muscle, so muscle mass for women as they age is a really important thing to try to maintain. There's no question that both your bone density, but also just your general overall health are linked to your muscle mass and your strength. Independent of sex, as you're aging, frailty, which is an interesting thing to try to define, but people have defined it in the geroscience community. And geriatricians actually can measure frailty by doing a series of tests on someone. And one of the best indicators of overall health and longevity in older adults is their ability to get up from a chair unassisted. And that's that's one of the ways that you can measure frailty. And so again, that really comes back to muscle strength. And I honestly, exercise is beneficial for your heart. I mean, it's beneficial to try to control weight. It can improve your mood just through endorphins. So, anything that can fight off those kinds of stress signals is really beneficial. And the last thing I'll say is sleep is really important. So one of the things that gets disrupted during perimenopause and menopause is sleep cycles. And so doing all the things you can to get a full night's rest is going to have a positive effect. I wish I had something more profound to say, but that's really the truth.
I think that's the reality. There is no silver bullet, and you should work on the basic. And hopefully, the research will give us maybe in the future a silver bullet, but no silver bullet today. That's the reality.
That's what we're hoping for.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I have a complicated, perhaps 3-part question. We're familiar with a lot of these symptoms that women experience during perimenopause. Are there things that women can do to try and mitigate some of those symptoms, or has research really been done into any of that yet?
Yeah, this is a really interesting question. So for perimenopause, I think there certainly are things that you could potentially do to try to mitigate them. If you can understand how and in what direction those hormones are fluctuating, certainly, low doses of HRT might be something that someone could try. Again, this is an area of medicine that really has a lot of room for exploration and improvement. I think this generation of women, my generation of women, maybe the generation right above me, are coming up against perimenopause, and rather than just kind of quietly accepting it, are stepping back and saying, wait a second, this is not something I signed up for. How can we fix this? So there's a lot of things that are changing right now, and that means too that medicine has to catch up. So I don't have any, I wish that I could say there's, this herb that you should take that's really going to help fix everything. I don't think there's a lot of evidence for most supplements making much of a difference. I think that we're still at the beginning of doing the research, and I hope that we'll be able to find things that will address both the symptoms, but also those underlying causes, so that we can give women not just parity and choice in their reproductive options, but also, more control over their overall health.
And post-menopause, is there any relief of symptoms, or are some of those changes kind of here to stay? They stick around indefinitely.
Well, I think once the menopausal transition is over, once everything kind of settles down to where the levels are going to be, I think many women don't have as many of those negative vasomotor symptoms, things like hot flashes and night sweats and things like that. But the negative health consequences that we talked about, those increased health risks from lower hormone levels, those are pretty much permanent. There are some therapeutic options available in the form of hormone replacement therapy, but again, those aren't for every woman. It's a Band-Aid. It's a good Band-Aid. It's maybe the best Band-Aid we have, but there's a lot of complexity to it, and it's not something that you want to take on lightly. You want to, again, have a conversation with your physician to see whether or not it's something that is right for you. But for women who are able to do HRT, in general, it's a good way to try to mitigate some of those side effects of menopause, for sure.
And that was the third part of my question was HRT, is that something, if it is appropriate for women, can help with those perimenopausal symptoms, as well as help to mitigate some of those longer term health impacts post-menopause?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of evidence that for women for whom it's safe, HRT has incredibly beneficial effects on all of those things. It's a complicated equation, and again, it's something that needs to be a conversation between a woman and her doctor. But there is the possibility for HRT to really have a beneficial effect. And my goal is to make HRT unnecessary. It's a moonshot goal, but that would be my goal.
And I will just note in our last episode with you that we did talk about HRT quite a bit, if anyone wanted to go back and listen in there.
Yeah, thanks for I really enjoy these conversations. So thank you so much for having me back on. This is great.
So if we would like to switch gear a bit and also talk maybe a bit about premenopausal women, we know that exercise is good for everybody. Doesn't matter if you are a male or female, postmenopausal, premenopausal. But I would like to zoom in, if possible, and define a bit what kind of exercise is the best exercise for a woman in a different stage of her age. Is there a kind of exercise that's better to do in a premenopausal versus perimenopausal versus postmenopausal?
Again, I'm not a physician, so I'm hesitant to give any advice. I think that there's clear evidence that most kinds of exercise are beneficial at every age, but certainly for women who are approaching perimenopause, really strength training and things that increase muscle mass are going to be really important. And then in postmenopausal women, I think as much as you can maintain your muscle mass, right? It becomes really difficult to maintain muscle mass after menopause because of all those changes. So again, like I said, it doesn't mean that you need to be running marathons. It just means that you need to be doing weight-bearing exercises and getting your heart rate up a little bit every day. There's huge benefits that have been shown just from walking. Just from getting outside and walking for half an hour or so a few times a week. So I think it's important to stress that like any level of physical activity is better than none. So yeah, those are that's my personal advice, not my professional advice.
No, absolutely. We know that you're a scientist and I'm a scientist and Ashley is a scientist, so we are not a physician. But we are talking evidence-based, so thank you so much for that.
Evidence-based, yeah. And there is science to support the idea that maintaining muscle mass with age is really just so important. No question.
On the nutrition side of things, I don't know if this is researched really too much. If we know how dietary needs change, certainly we know aging, you might have higher protein requirements in order to maintain that muscle mass. Curious if there's conceptually any other types of, nutrition considerations that should be made in that postmenopausal period.
I think there's evidence to suggest that, everything you can do to maintain your metabolic health. So, as you age, both men and women, your metabolism slows down and you become more prone to metabolic disease, like diabetes and things like that. So, watching your sugar intake is probably a good idea. And for women, paying attention to calcium levels and vitamin D levels. That doesn't mean that you should just, be chowing down on supplements, but having, regular monitoring and checking in on what those levels are and modifying them as needed is going to be really important, again, for bone health and for a whole host of other things as well. And I do think that there's something to be said for thinking about how your diet impacts, your overall feeling of well-being. And so different people need different diets, and we're all different in terms of, what kind of food our bodies respond well to. So I think by the time you get to the age of menopause, you should know your body pretty well. And so listening to your body, and again, talking to your doctor, and bringing up any concerns, anything that's different or changing. This is something I tell women of all ages, is that, physicians, OBGYNs in particular, don't receive a lot of training around women's health. They don't receive a lot of training right now around perimenopause and menopause. And so it's so important that you communicate with your physician, that you tell them what's going on, that you vocalize when something's changed or something's different, or when you notice something happening, because as much as, their goal is to help you, I think the more you can have an open dialogue, the more likely it is that you'll get good care.
Yeah. And Jennifer, to follow up on that, on your point about don't take too much, we've seen it a lot with our users that a lot of them are consuming too much, for example, vitamin B12, because why not? More is better, and it's not the case. More is not the better. And I just listened to an interview of one of our users that basically had a lot of rashes on his skin, and he didn't know what to do, and his physician didn't know what is that, so he sent him to the dermatologist, and the dermatologist didn't know what to do. And then we tested him, and his B12 was on the roof. He stopped taking vitamin B12, and suddenly it went down. So again, everything should be in moderation, and you need to test and be sure that you have the right amount, and don't start consuming zillion amount of calcium or vitamin D, because too much is not always good.
Too much is not good.
Yeah.
Your liver has the ability to regenerate, but that goes down with age. And
Yeah.
your liver is what detoxifies your system and takes all of those excess compounds that you ingest out of circulation and excretes them. And you can really damage your liver by taking too many supplements or too much of a particular vitamin.
Yeah.
And truly the best source of vitamins and minerals is going to come from your food. And so thinking about how you can get those vitamins and minerals that you might need from food sources is really the best way to approach it. Taking a bunch of pills is definitely not the answer.
I think you've highlighted so many times just the areas that we need so much more research, and so much related to perimenopause and postmenopause. So just again, I wanted to give you an opportunity to mention what you're doing, trying to encourage research in this area as well, and how people can find more information on that.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate it. I co-founded and I direct this thing called the Global Consortium for Reproductive Longevity and Equality, the GCRLE, which is a mouthful. But every piece of that is important. And our goal is to try to understand what causes reproductive decline in women, what causes ovarian aging, what causes ovaries to age prematurely, so that we can develop interventions that would slow it down. And really, if I step back and frame it just for a general audience, our goal is just to sync up aging in the reproductive system in women with aging in the rest of their bodies, right? Right now, ovaries, they stop functioning in the middle of a woman's life, and that has all these profound consequences, not just for fertility, and for miscarriages and birth defects, but also for overall health. Because as we mentioned, ovaries make this cocktail of hormones that are so important for overall health. And so our goal is to try to expand funding for research, to build the ecosystem around this area of research so that we bring together scientists, clinicians, people from biotech and pharma and funders and ambassadors like you. We want to bring everyone into the same room so that we can accelerate progress in this area. We want to translate things faster from the bench in the lab into women's hands faster. And so the way that we're doing that right now is, like I said, we're giving away grants to scientists to fund research all over the world. We're trying to pull in the most creative people to focus their attention on this problem because it's not an unsolvable problem. We just have to devote time and resources to it. And in parallel to that, we're building out resources, not just for the scientists, but for the entire field. So on our website, gcrle.org, you can find a white paper that's written for a non-science audience about what we're doing. We are building a knowledge hub, which would include information about not just topics in women's health, but also the biology and really digging deep into the science. And we're calibrating that at a level that should be accessible to every person on the planet, but that has multiple layers of depth. So you can start out with just understanding what things are and then dig deeper if you want to learn about the research that's going on right now. And the key to what we're putting out there is that, we're a nonprofit. We're not trying to sell anyone anything. So that information is going to be vetted by scientists and doctors, and it's going to be there, not trying to sell you anything. And beyond that, I think this should be top of mind for every person in the world. Young women should care about this because it's so important that they have all the information they need about their bodies and about what's happening in their reproductive systems, so that they can make informed decisions as they're planning their careers and their lives. Older women should care about this because hopefully the research that we're doing will help to come up with solutions that will mitigate some of those negative health consequences even after menopause. Men should care about this in addition to caring about it because they might have female daughters or mothers or sisters or partners or friends. There are genetic components to this that transcend sex. So, we mentioned that reproductive span is linked to overall lifespan. That's also true for brothers. So women who go through menopause later tend to live longer. Their male brothers also tend to live longer. So there are things that we can learn from ovarian aging that will hopefully give us clues about aging in the rest of the body. And finally, there's a profound and dramatic impact of menopause, economically speaking, on the world. There's a huge impact of all of the women who are currently in menopause and who are going into pause in terms of economic costs. So I don't want to leave you on a negative note. So I would say that we're in a really historic moment right now where societal taboos around female bodies are being shattered. We're having conversations about periods and about menopause and about infertility and sex and in ways that we haven't before. And I think women all over the world are really pushing for open and honest conversations that are going to normalize reproductive health issues and tackle these questions around infertility and menopause. And so, join us. We want everyone who has an interest in the space to be part of our network. So our website is gcrle.org.
Awesome. And thank you for your work bringing attention to this. Truthfully, I will say that I was blind and very ignorant to a lot of the, as you mentioned last time, inequalities and just what happens to us, to 50% of the world. So for those scientists looking to make a big impact, you have a very large bucket of things that you could investigate that can have direct impact on 50%, more than 50% of the population.
Yeah, it's profound. I mean, I think it's the most important thing that we can talk about right now.
And last time we asked you about a top tip for health span. So this time I'm going to try and make it a little bit different and just see if you have any advice, encouragement, or tips for women that are currently going through the menopausal transition that you'd be willing to share.
Oh yeah, I think right now there are so many more resources today than there were 3 years ago when we started, and I think that finding a community, finding a good healthcare provider is task number one. And the North American Menopause Society, NAMS, has a list of physicians that they certify who have been trained in treating women in perimenopause and menopause. So finding a good physician to help you through this time is really, really key. There aren't nearly enough of them, by the way, but they do exist. The second piece of advice I would say is to find a community. So there's a fantastic patient advocacy group that again is a nonprofit and doesn't have ties to any commercial or professional interests, called the National Menopause Foundation. And they have some fantastic resources on their website, but they also have a forum for women to talk to each other, to find out, basically to have conversations with other people who are going through the same thing. And they've got a couple of other, they've got some resources in the form of like podcasts and other social media stuff. So I would just say, seek out people who are having the same experience and share your experience. I think there's a lot of power in community.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us again.
This was really
Thanks for having
fascinating.
me.
Jennifer, that was fascinating. We really want to thank you for that. And we look forward to explore the research in the field of longevity each month with you and leading scientists. For more information, please go to www.insidetracker.com/podcast. Again, thank you so much, Jennifer. That was amazing.
Thank you, Gil.
Thanks for listening to Longevity by Design. Please subscribe to this podcast on Apple, Spotify, or YouTube. Longevity by Design is powered by Inside Tracker, a personalized health optimization platform that helps people improve their lives by improving their bodies from the inside out using personalized, science-backed recommendations for nutrition, supplements, and lifestyle changes. To learn more, visit insidetracker.com/podcast.